It was the kind of barbecue that everyone dreams of: perfect weather, friends and family gathering in the backyard, and the grill sizzling with delicious food. But as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the backyard, I had no idea that just behind me, in the shadows of the tall fence, a storm was brewing. A storm that would turn my peaceful gathering into a neighborhood showdown. It all started when Karen, the house.Karen, knocked on my door, wearing her trademark look of disapproval. I'd barely heard the knock over the music and laughter of my guests when I opened the door, and there she was. Arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. It was like she was ready to declare war over the fact that I had the audacity to throw a barbecue in my own backyard. But I couldn't have known just how far she was willing to go to ruin my fun. Before I could even greet her, she snapped, "You're not allowed to have this party. This is a quiet neighborhood. People are trying to relax." She was already cutting to the chase, as if her mere presence was enough to make me bow down to her demands. At first, I thought she was joking. I mean, who could be upset at a barbecue? The smell of burgers and the sound of kids laughing should be a good thing, right? But no, Karen wasn't joking. She went on about the noise, the crowd, and how this barbecue was disturbing her peaceful life. The way she was speaking, you'd think I was throwing a rave or something. I tried to explain that it was a simple gathering and everyone was just enjoying the weekend, but that only seemed to make her angrier. "I don't care what you think," she shot back, her voice rising. "This is the kind of thing that will ruin the neighborhood. You're being selfish." I stood there, dumbfounded. This was supposed to be a fun day with friends, and here was Karen, trying to make it feel like I was the bad guy. I calmly told her I was within my rights to have a barbecue and that she needed to relax, but Karen was far from relaxing. She told me she was calling the HOA and that I would regret it. That's when I realized she wasn't just upset, she was using her position on the HOA board to make this personal. She wasn't just some neighbor who wanted peace and quiet. She was trying to enforce rules that didn't exist. Not wanting to escalate things immediately, I told her to do whatever she felt was necessary and closed the door. But the moment I turned back to the party, I could feel the tension. My guests, who had been laughing and talking just moments before, were now watching me. I didn't know what to expect next. Would she call the police? Would she try to stop the party in front of everyone? I tried to shake it off and went back to the grill, but my mind kept racing. Karen wasn't the type of person who would just let things go, and I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. What started as a simple barbecue was quickly spiraling into something much bigger. I had no idea that, by the end of the night, Karen's interference would spark a neighborhood-wide showdown that no one would forget. And that's exactly what happened. Just when I thought the night was back on track, Karen wasn't done. As I flipped the burgers and chatted with friends, I saw her walking across the yard toward me again. She was holding her phone this time. Without a word, she dialed the HOA, and I could hear her loudly explaining the disruption that was happening. I tried to ignore her at first, but it was clear that Karen had no intention of letting me have even a few hours of fun. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a fight that would involve more than just Karen, and soon the entire neighborhood would be divided over my barbecue. As Karen's voice grew louder on the phone, I realized she wasn't just talking about my party anymore. She was trying to turn my simple get-together into a battle for control. But little did she know, I wasn't backing down. This was my home, my backyard, and if she thought she could scare me off, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Little did I know, this barbecue would go down in neighborhood history as the moment when Karen and I would face off in a war over property rights, noise complaints, and the right to enjoy life without a self-appointed HOA dictator ruining everything. The first shot was fired, but I wasn't about to let it end here. "Karen," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice calm, "this is my property. You can't just tell me to shut it down because you don't like the noise. We're not doing anything wrong." She crossed her arms and scowled at me. You're making a mistake. I'll make sure you regret it, she threatened. Her words stung, but I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I knew she was overstepping her bounds, and I wasn't going to back down just because she was throwing around her HOA power. The next few moments felt like a blur. Karen stormed off, still muttering under her breath about how she was going to call the police, but I wasn't worried. I had every right to have a barbecue on my own property, and I wasn't going to let her ruin my day. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that she wasn't in charge here. I had already planned for this, and I knew I had the legal right to enjoy my home without her interference. As I turned back to the grill, I could hear Karen talking to someone else at the edge of the yard. She was telling them about the disruption and how I was causing chaos in the neighborhood. It felt like she was exaggerating the situation, making it sound like my barbecue was a major disturbance when, in reality, it was just a few people enjoying a meal. But that didn't seem to matter to her. She was determined to turn this into a bigger issue than it needed to be. Just then, one of my neighbors, Dave, walked up to me. "Hey, everything all right?" he asked, noticing the tension in the air. I let out a sigh. "Yeah, just Karen being Karen. She's upset about the noise, thinks it's too loud for the neighborhood." Dave raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? This is the quietest barbecue I've ever been to. Everyone's just hanging out." I nodded, thankful that someone else saw the situation for what it was. "Exactly. But she's calling the HOA, making threats about police involvement." Dave shook his head. "Unbelievable. You know what? I'll tell you what. You keep having fun, and if she tries anything, I'll back you up. We've got your back, man." His words were a huge relief. I knew Dave and several other neighbors, and I could tell that they weren't happy about Karen's behavior. It felt good to know that I wasn't alone in this. If it came down to a bigger confrontation, I had people on my side. With Dave's support, I returned to the grill and tried to shake off the negativity. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that Karen was still lurking nearby, plotting her next move. Sure enough, just as I was serving up some burgers, I saw her talking to a couple of other neighbors, whispering and pointing in my direction. It was clear she was trying to rally support for her cause. The tension in the air was palpable, but I refused to let Karen ruin this day. I wasn't the one in the wrong here, she was. And if she thought she could bully me into ending my party, she was going to have another thing coming. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. If Karen wasn't going to let this go, then neither was I. It wasn't just a battle over noise, it was about standing my ground and protecting my right to enjoy my property without being harassed by someone who thought they could dictate my every move. Just when I thought things might settle down, Karen's next move made it clear that she wasn't finished yet. As the evening wore on, I was trying my best to stay calm and keep the atmosphere light. Guests were mingling, kids were running around playing games, and the sound of laughter filled the air. It was everything a good barbecue should be. But as much as I tried to ignore Karen, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't going to let this go. Just as I was chatting with a couple of friends, I heard a familiar voice calling out from behind me. It was Karen again. This time, she wasn't alone. She had two more neighbors with her, and the look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They weren't here to just enjoy the party, they were here to challenge it. "Hey, we need to talk," Karen said, as she and her companions approached. I could see the disapproving look on her face, but I wasn't in the mood for a confrontation. "Not now, Karen," I replied, trying to brush her off as politely as I could. "We're having a party, people are enjoying themselves. There's no need for more drama." But Karen wasn't having any of it. "Oh, there's going to be drama, all right," she snapped. "You need to shut this down right now. I've already called the HOA. You're violating the neighborhood rules. This is unacceptable." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the tension rising. The last thing I wanted was for my guests to witness a heated argument. But Karen had made her move, and there was no turning back now. "I don't know what rules you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my property, and I'm within my rights to have people over for a barbecue. You're just upset because you're not part of the fun." Karen smirked, clearly not buying it. "I'm not the only one upset. Just wait until the HOA hears about this. They'll make sure you never throw another party again." Her threats weren't surprising, but they were still annoying. I wasn't about to let her bully me into submission. Not in my own yard. Not in front of my friends and family. "I've already had enough of this," I said, my patience wearing thin. "If the HOA wants to get involved, they can. But I'm not shutting this down because you're upset. You don't own this neighborhood, Karen." Her face turned a deep shade of red, and I could see her seething with anger. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed. "You're going to regret this." Before I could respond, one of the neighbors she had brought along stepped forward. "Karen's right," the man said, crossing his arms. "This isn't the way we do things around here. You've got to think about the rest of the neighborhood. It's getting out of hand." I glanced at him, frustrated, but I didn't let his words get to me. I had dealt with people like this before, neighbors who thought they knew best, who wanted to enforce rules that didn't even exist. They didn't understand what it meant to simply have a good time. "Look," I said, trying to keep things civil, "we're just enjoying a barbecue. There's no law against it. People have parties all the time. This is no different. If you have a problem with it, you're welcome to leave." The man hesitated for a moment, but Karen quickly jumped in. Karen had made it clear that she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. And I knew this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. The party went on, but the undercurrent of tension remained. I couldn't help but wonder how far Karen would go to ruin this day. And whether the HOA would really back her up in the end. The night was beginning to settle in, and with it, a strange calm swept over the backyard. The music continued to play softly, the smell of grilled food still lingering in the air, but my mind was far from relaxed. Karen had just stormed off, threatening the involvement of the HOA and the police, but I could feel that this wasn't going to end quietly. In fact, I had a feeling that it was only going to escalate from here. The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, continued to enjoy themselves, but I could tell that some of them were starting to feel uncomfortable. The last thing I wanted was for the tension to ruin the party, but it was hard to ignore the looming cloud of uncertainty that Karen had created. The truth was, I didn't know if the HOA would actually get involved or if the police would show up at my door. But one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down. As I went to check on the grill, one of my neighbors, Lisa, pulled me aside. "Hey, are you okay? What's going on with Karen?" I gave her a quick smile, trying to reassure her. "Yeah, it's just Karen being Karen. She's upset about the noise, wants me to shut down the barbecue. But I'm not letting her dictate what I can do in my own yard." Lisa nodded, but there was concern in her eyes. "I get it, but you know how Karen is. She's not going to just let this go. She'll probably go over your head to the HOA. It's not just her. Some other neighbors have been talking about this too." I sighed. "I know. But I've done nothing wrong. This is my property. I have every right to throw a party, especially on a weekend." "True," Lisa said, "but I just don't want this to get out of hand. Karen can be relentless." I appreciated her concern, but I wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else ruin my evening. "I'll deal with it," I said, more confidently than I felt. "If she wants to take it further, I'm ready for whatever comes next." The conversation with Lisa gave me a small sense of reassurance, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. Just as I was about to turn back to the grill, I saw her again. This time, she was standing near the end of the block, speaking to another neighbor, Greg. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was unmistakable. Karen was rallying support. I felt a twinge of frustration. Why couldn't she just let people enjoy their lives? It wasn't like I was throwing a huge party or making noise until all hours of the night. It was just a simple gathering. But Karen, with her self-righteous attitude and her obsession with order, was turning it into a battle. And I could see that she wasn't going to rest until she had some kind of victory. As the evening wore on, Karen's influence seemed to spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. More neighbors began to make their way past my yard, giving me pointed looks, shaking their heads, or muttering something about noise. I could feel the pressure mounting. I was still determined to stand my ground, but now, more than ever, it felt like I was at the center of a neighborhood battle. I knew I couldn't let her win. But at the same time, I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. It was a delicate balance, trying to enjoy the party, keep the peace with the neighbors who weren't on Karen's side, and preparing for the inevitable HOA confrontation that was looming on the horizon. And then, as if things weren't tense enough, I got a text from one of my friends who had left early. "Dude, Karen is telling people that you're disrupting the entire neighborhood. She's saying you're ruining the vibe for everyone. What's going on?" I felt my blood pressure rise as I read the message. What's going on was simple: Karen was spreading lies to anyone who would listen. I knew it wouldn't take long for the whole neighborhood to hear her version of events, which, of course, was completely distorted. The barbecue wasn't disrupting anyone, it was just a few people enjoying a Saturday night in my yard. But Karen had turned it into a personal vendetta, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep it under control. Just as I was about to respond to my friend, the front door opened. I turned to see my wife, Sarah, standing there with a look of concern on her face. "Hey, can we talk for a second?" she asked, stepping outside. I walked over to her, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Yeah, what's up?" She lowered her voice, glancing around before speaking. "I just got a call from someone. They said Karen's calling the police." I froze. The last thing I needed was for the police to show up and make this whole situation worse. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered under my breath. Sarah nodded. "She's telling them that the noise is too much, that we're causing a disturbance. She's really pushing this." I took a deep breath. I don't know what she thinks the police are going to do. This is my property. We're having a small get-together, nothing crazy. "I know," Sarah said, giving me a sympathetic look. "But you know how Karen is. She doesn't stop until she gets her way." I turned back to the yard, where the last few guests were still hanging out. It was obvious to me now that this barbecue had become more than just a party, it had become a symbol of my fight for my rights, my property, and my peace of mind. And Karen wasn't going to let it go easily. As I stood there, I knew the next few moments would determine whether or not this would turn into something much bigger. The police were on their way, and I had to be ready to defend my right to have a quiet, enjoyable evening in my own yard. The sound of a car pulling up in front of my house broke the uneasy silence that had settled over the party. I froze. My heart started to race as I looked over at Sarah, who was standing beside me. She had heard it too, the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this. I had hoped Karen would back off, but of course, she didn't. She had gone and called the police, just like she promised. As the flashing lights illuminated the driveway, I could feel the eyes of the few remaining guests on me. Some were unsure of what was happening, while others were clearly starting to feel uncomfortable. I tried to put on a calm face, but inside, I was a bundle of nerves. I wasn't sure what the police could do, but I didn't want my guests to think I was causing trouble. I didn't want to look like the bad guy in all of this. The officers stepped out of the car, their expressions neutral but professional. They didn't seem overly concerned, but I could see that they were taking the situation seriously. One officer approached me, while the other spoke with Karen, who had quickly positioned herself as the self-appointed victim in this scenario. "Good evening, sir," the officer said. "We received a call about a noise disturbance. Can you tell me what's going on?" I took a deep breath and explained the situation. "This is a small family barbecue. There's nothing out of the ordinary. The noise is not excessive, and we're just enjoying a weekend together." The officer nodded, his gaze briefly drifting over to Karen, who was standing at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, watching us like a hawk. "Is this your property, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but businesslike. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my composure. "It's my property. We've been having a barbecue for the last few hours, and I'm within my rights to do so. There's no disturbance beyond the normal sounds of people having a good time on a Saturday evening." The officer didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't appear to be ready to take action either. He glanced over at Karen, who was practically radiating anger. I could tell she was trying to make herself the center of attention, hoping that the officers would take her side. At that moment, the other officer came over and spoke to his partner in low tones. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but it didn't take a genius to figure out that Karen was painting a very different picture of what had been happening. I could see her gesturing wildly, probably telling them that the barbecue was some kind of outrageous party and that I was disturbing the peace. I couldn't believe this was happening. A simple backyard barbecue, meant to be a few hours of fun, had turned into a police intervention. But I knew I had to remain calm. I wasn't doing anything wrong. This wasn't a disturbance, it was just a bunch of people enjoying a beautiful evening together. As the officers approached Karen, I could hear the words "noise complaints" and "disruption" being tossed around. I quickly stepped forward, trying to explain myself before she could dominate the conversation. "Look," I said, trying to remain respectful, "I understand that some people might not like the noise, but we're not being disruptive. We're not throwing a loud party, and this is a private gathering. I'm sorry if it's bothering anyone, but it's just a barbecue. We're winding down for the evening." Karen's face twisted in disbelief as she stepped closer to the officer. "It's not just the noise. It's the entire vibe. This kind of thing is ruining the neighborhood. I can't even sit in my backyard without hearing all of this." She gestured to the grill, the music in the background, and the laughter of my guests. I wanted to scream at her, but I kept my cool. This was my property, and she was trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. The officer looked at me and then at Karen, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he turned to the other officer and nodded, signaling for him to come back over. "Sir, we'll have to ask you to keep the noise level down. If we get more complaints, we might need to take further action. But for now, it seems like there's no need to shut this down. We're just here to ensure everyone's safe and that the peace is maintained." I nodded, relieved that the situation hadn't gotten any worse. "I'll make sure it stays under control," I said, trying to end the conversation on a positive note. The officers exchanged a few words with Karen, who was still fuming but seemed to realize that she wasn't going to get her way this time. I could hear her muttering angrily, but she didn't press the matter any further. As the officers left, I turned back to my guests, who were now watching the whole situation unfold. The party had slowed down a bit, and some of the energy had been lost. But I wasn't about to let Karen win. I wasn't about to let her ruin my evening or my property. Once the police had driven off, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle in. It felt like the calm after a storm, but I knew it wasn't over. Karen had already made it clear that she wasn't done with me, and if I didn't handle this carefully, it could drag on longer than I wanted. But for now, I just needed to focus on the rest of the evening. The barbecue had been interrupted, but it wasn't over yet. I was still determined to enjoy the night, and I knew I wasn't going to let Karen or anyone else take that away from me. I grabbed a drink, gave a few reassuring nods to my guests, and silently prepared myself for the next round in the battle that had somehow turned a peaceful Saturday evening into a full-on neighborhood dispute. As the night wore on, the mood at the barbecue was noticeably different. While the music was still playing, and the food continued to be passed around, the earlier tension had left a mark on everyone. Karen had stirred the pot, and now, even though the police had left and things had somewhat returned to normal, the uneasy feeling lingered. I kept a close eye on the crowd, making sure no one felt uncomfortable or tense because of what had just happened. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about the next step. Karen wasn't the type of person to let things go, and I knew this wasn't the last time I'd hear from her. As much as I wanted to just enjoy the rest of the night, I could feel the storm on the horizon. She had made it clear that she wasn't done with me, and something told me that the HOA wasn't going to stay out of this for long. I wasn't sure how long I could keep my cool under all this pressure, but I wasn't about to give in. Around 9 p.m., just as the party was starting to wind down, I received an unexpected call. It was from the HOA. My heart sank as I looked at the caller ID. I knew exactly why they were calling. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, is this my name?" a voice on the other end asked. It was the HOA president. "Yes, it is," I replied. My stomach churned as I braced myself for what was coming next. "We received several complaints about the noise from your barbecue," the president said, his voice polite but firm. "And we've been informed that the police were called. We need to discuss this matter further." I couldn't believe it. Karen had gone straight to the HOA to back up her complaints, trying to turn this simple barbecue into a major issue. I could feel my blood starting to boil, but I knew I had to stay calm. I didn't want to make things worse. "I understand the concerns, but I want to make it clear that I was within my rights to have a small gathering in my own backyard," I said, trying to stay composed. "There was no excessive noise, no major disturbances. This is just a regular weekend barbecue." The HOA president was silent for a moment, as though weighing my words. "I understand, but it's the HOA's responsibility to ensure that the neighborhood remains peaceful and respectful to all residents. This isn't about one event, but about setting a precedent. If we allow this kind of gathering to go unchecked, it could create issues down the line." I bit my lip, holding back my frustration. This wasn't about peace. This was about Karen's personal vendetta against me and my barbecue. It wasn't even about the neighborhood's peace, it was about Karen wanting to control everything around her. "I get it," I said, my voice colder now. "But I didn't break any rules. I've lived here long enough to know what's allowed and what's not. This was a simple gathering, and if people are complaining about it, that's on them, not me." The HOA president's tone shifted slightly, as though he was beginning to see my side of things. "I understand your position, but we do need to address the complaints formally. Can you come in for a meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation?" I knew what this was. It was Karen's attempt to make me feel like I was in the wrong, to force me to give in and apologize for something I had every right to do. But I wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything that had happened. "I'll come in for the meeting," I replied, not backing down. "But I want to make it clear that I'm not removing the fence, I'm not stopping the BBQs, and I'm not going to let anyone tell me how to use my own property." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Understood," the president finally said. "We'll see you tomorrow." The call ended, and I stood there, staring at my phone for a moment. I wasn't surprised that Karen had managed to involve the HOA. I had known from the start that she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. But I was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. This was about standing my ground. The next day, I made my way to the HOA office for the meeting. I walked in with a stack of documents, property maps, photos of the barbecue, records of the noise levels, and even the footage from the security cameras that had captured Karen's earlier confrontation. I wasn't going to walk into this meeting unprepared. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I sat down in the meeting room, waiting for Karen to show up. When she did, she had that same smug look on her face, as if she thought she had already won. But she didn't know what I had prepared. The meeting started with the HOA president outlining the complaints. "We've heard from several residents about the noise and the disturbance," he said, looking at me. "Karen has raised concerns about the impact of your gatherings on the neighborhood." I looked directly at Karen and then at the board members. "I understand the concerns," I said, "but I want to be clear that I'm not breaking any rules. I've done nothing wrong. This is my property, and I have the right to host guests without interference." Karen's face reddened as she shot me a glare, but I could see that some of the board members were beginning to look uncomfortable. They had no real grounds to stand on. The more I explained, the more they seemed to realize that Karen's complaints were just personal attacks. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's attempt to bully me had failed. The board agreed that I wasn't in violation of any rules, and they promised to send a letter to all residents reminding them of the importance of respecting each other's property. Karen, though, didn't take it well. As she left the room, she muttered something about not being done with me yet, but I knew she had lost this round. The HOA had backed down, and the rest of the neighborhood slowly came to realize that I wasn't the one in the wrong. The following weekend, I threw another barbecue. This time, there was no Karen trying to ruin the fun, and the neighborhood seemed to be in better spirits. People started to approach me with a newfound respect, and I knew that, despite the challenges, I had won. In the end, Karen's attempt to control my life had backfired. I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was standing up for everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA or a neighbor with too much power. And that's what made this barbecue unforgettable.